Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Jordan. This has been a really interesting discussion so far. Yeah, we're moving on a little bit from what we've talked about so far, but I'm sure picking up some of the similar themes. But we've got two people with us today. So we've got Neil Durno from Voltempo and Dan Lucy-Lloyd from Fuuse as well. And by way of introduction, yes. So I'm Louise Evans, and I am a policy manager at Energy UK. And for those of you who don't know, Energy UK is the trade association for the energy sector. So covering everything from energy generation through to supply and all of the low carbon tech in between. So whether that's charge point operators, heat pumps, manufacturing, the whole breadth. So yeah, I'll kick off with a few different questions because we've got a lot to cover in the next hour or so. But we've heard a lot around kind of reliability and interoperability, everything from AI to flex markets, and what still needs to change from a policy and infrastructure perspective. This is all in the context of the different phase out targets across the transport sector. So, whether that's the ZEV mandate in 2030 for cars, 2035 for vans, and the various different targets coming down the road for HGVs. Um, so to kick us off, Neil, I'll hand to you. So could you tell us a bit about what Voltempo does and kind of what you're seeing in the market, the kind of biggest opportunity right now?
Yes. Good morning, Louise. Thanks for inviting me on. Yeah, Voltempo have been involved in HGV electrification now through the government's ZHID program, which is the Zero Emission HGV Infrastructure Demonstrator. So that's been sort of in the offing now for 3 years since the grants were applied for and then awarded. So there's four projects, and the E-Freight 2030 project is one of those four that is operating in the UK, in our instance, with nine transport operators running 35 sites with a total of 90 electric tractor units going out across a whole range of use cases for those operators, and with a range of depot-based charging solutions that are running out of various of their operating centres. And so, in that, we are here as a facilitator with a lead consortium party, and the raison d'etre is to help the industry learn. And the obligation under the funding is that we disseminate that learning. And although we've spent the last 2 years in deployment, we now have another 5 years of operation where that reporting will happen, all the vehicles that are on the road, and we'll continue to disseminate the learnings into the market.
Great, and I'm sure we'll come onto all of those topics throughout this. But I'll just hand to Dan to introduce yourself. So, what's your kind of role at Fuuse, and what kind of stage of the market do you see the transition at? So, are we in early transition? Are we scaling? Are we at that maturity phase? How do you see it from your side?
Yeah, so I'm Dan. So I'm the Network Services Director here at Fuuse. Also one of the founders. So been with the business for about 7.5 years. So for anyone that's not aware, we're the UK's leading charge point management system. So our customers are operating chargers across a large number of different sectors, from pure public CPOs through to fleets and workplace chargers, and we have a lot of installer customers as well that white label the platform and kind of sell it on for themselves as well. So we get a really good top-down view of what's going on across the whole spectrum of the industry, I think. So I think for us the stuff that's kind of changing at the moment is I think we're moving out of that early adopter phase and into that just sort of operational phase. I think going back sort of 12, 18 months, a lot of the customers that were coming to us were still installing their first chargers. So, they were coming and saying, "Hey, we've got a fleet of 5 vehicles, and we need to get some chargers in the ground." Whereas now that's actually quite rare. Most of the businesses that we're working with are onto their second generation of rollout. They're scaling up. So I think that's kind of the biggest change we're seeing, and with that comes a big shift towards operational optimization. It's not enough to just have the infrastructure. It's got to work, and it's got to work well. And I think the questions and maturity that's coming from customers as well, is changing dramatically. In terms of the education levels of fleet managers and facilities managers. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of some of the conflict that exists between fleet and facilities. But the level of education and experience that people have got in those areas now when they're coming to us is increasing rapidly. So I don't think we're sort of out of the early adopter phase yet, but I think we're sort of getting to the end of that, and that's creating some new challenges and new opportunities.
And what do you think has kind of caused that shift? Is it just the economics? Is it customer expectations? Is it policy, or kind of a mix of all of that?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. Policy is obviously is obviously driving things a lot, and I think the policy needs to remain strong. I think the key thing, the policy needs to remain consistent. I think that's really, really important. I think customers often express a lot of frustration at not necessarily being able to have that crystal ball and see, well, what's the next government going to say about all of this, and are they going to be ripping the rug out from it. But I think the reality is that we're thankfully now at a point where the commercials are starting to stack up and the economics are starting to stack up. And I think those customers that are moving in, past that sort of first, let's get something in the ground phase, or let's get, 10% of our vehicles moved over, are starting to see that actually this works. It works operationally, it works economically, and we're actually seeing customers wanting to accelerate their rollouts faster than policy is sort of dictating, which is great.
If I can build on that from Dan's points, the thing that's really worked is £1 billion of government investment, not least in the depot charging scheme, right? That has unlocked people that had a desire but an uncertainty in certain aspects about the affordability because it was unknown to many of them. And
Yeah.
so I think there's a real mix, right, around the size and nature of the vehicle fleets. So I think to Dan's point, that's kind of in the commercial space and maybe entering into some of the lorry market. But we look at the lorry market as being very new,
Yeah.
really early adopter stage. Um, our friends like Paul Kirby have often cited that the van market is often forgotten. And there was a lot of money went into cars, and then a lot of money went into ZHID. Well, now there's a different because of the depot charging scheme, which is allowing people to either take their first steps, but less than just a really meager step, or to invest as their next step. And I think that with the policy is good, right? And I think what we then need to see is more than just a very big stick ZEV mandate behind this, and actually see some progressive development strands as part of a long-term program with a direction of travel. And that gives the market confidence. That allows the market to not concern itself with what's the next knee jerk or change or rug from under the feet perspective. All right. And so that's what we're seeing now. People have a bit more confidence. But certainly many are in first foray. They're in there, and I often say to people, if you're listening and learning, but you're not doing, you're really slowing your opportunity to learn. Do something modest. The depot charging scheme is a great way to fund that. The plug-in truck grant is a great way to fund that. Um, and then work out what you can do within the constraints of the DNO without spending too much money. What we will wait to see is the infrastructure strategy that is imminent, that is been drafted, is under review, and we'll then start to understand how we unlock some of the grid aspects to this.
Yeah, definitely. So it's all about the certainty and allowing industry to get the infrastructure ready and in the ground. So I guess from your side, operating this technology and making sure that it's ready. So, we've talked a little bit about uptime, but how do we make sure that charge points are there and ready when you need them? Because that's a big part of bringing, these logistics firms, normal everyday drivers along. So how do we design that reliability into the tech, and what standards should we be looking towards?
So I can have a go at this first. So the I think we obviously had the public charge point regulations come out last year, and I think they they've been successful in bringing a focus onto reliability, obviously primarily from a consumer perspective, but we've definitely seen an increased focus from across the board. Those numbers and all of the the other requirements, things like driver support and stuff like that. We've seen a massive increase in expectation from fleet customers as well on that. I think the reality is that drivers of any sort just expect a certain level of experience when they're charging. But I think it, policy is only ever going to go so far, and it needs to start the conversation, I think. But you've got to get to a point where the kind of commercials are going to drive it past a certain point. And reliability has been a really massive word in EV for the last 18 months. But if you look at things like the 99% uptime, that's a requirement now under the PCPR. What does that actually mean? And what it means is that your charger is on and communicating with its back office 99% of the time. Great. But we see quite a big gap between what is essentially the OCPP uptime, the uptime of the charger, which is what the government is mandating against, versus what is the reality of the experience. Like these are still very complicated ecosystems. A charger is only one small part of it. Often in the public domain, especially, you've got a broad spectrum of different things that are all talking to each other. You've got a charger, you've got a payment terminal, you've got a back office, you've got load balancing, you've got all the other things that go into ensuring that there's a successful session. In fact, I was doing a workshop internally yesterday about contactless payments, and we were talking about we were mapping out all the stages between starting a session, and between driver plugs in and session starts, we had about 25 events that all had to go correctly if the session was to be successful. And outside of all of that, the charger could be up and running and working absolutely, and communicating, and that wouldn't come into if any part of that session failed, that wouldn't trigger the PCPR. So I think we need to start talking about different metrics. So things like first time charge success, and things like that are more important. And I think we need to try and bring this out of just the consumer and the public domain, and start making sure that some of these things are applicable to a fleet perspective as well. The reality is that for a fleet, I mean, we can talk about the sort of criticality of reliability. From a public charge point, obviously that's revenue, and that's business critical for whoever's operating it. But from a fleet perspective, it can be far bigger than that. If I'm operating a delivery fleet, and my contract with a big supermarket is on the line, if I don't manage to make that delivery, that's not just going to cost me hundreds of pounds of lost revenue from lost sessions. If that charger's offline for 6 hours, it could cost me hundreds of thousands of pounds of fines and contracts and things like that. So in some ways, the fleet and freight aspect of this is more important than the consumer side. And I think that's coupled as well with the sort of risk factors as well. And these are all things that will slow down adoption and slow down the transition. Is that if a fleet's there saying, well, we can move 10% of our fleet over, but we need to make sure we've got that backbone and that backup of ICE vehicles that can make the deliveries when something goes wrong. That's not the perception we need to have within the industry. And I think we're still sort of in that space.
Yeah, I reinforce Dan's point entirely. A lot of what can go wrong is digital, not physical.
Yeah.
Right? I remember Drew from Hubject when I first met him several years ago. They had some stats on the uptime and where the problems lay, and I think dramatically more than 60% were of a digital nature. The other thing we have to remember is this is a system. We've got a vehicle and a charger and a human and a comms network, right, and a backbone. Even in the last 3 weeks, we've chased our tail down to find out that actually the socket wasn't pushed home deep enough into the truck. And so we were all scrabbling around trying to work out why it wasn't working. And it was a simple physical issue, right? And so that snug fit is something we just need to educate everybody about. The circumstances, they see a message on a screen and then they've not been taught what that means. Should I not plug in? Should I plug in? If I plug in, will it start up anyway? If it doesn't start up, do I have an RFID card that I can then override and start a session with? All these things are systematic, right? And so we've got to look at it holistically. But very much at this point, the implication of not being able to dispatch vehicles is absolutely bread and butter stuff to transport operators. And so the expectations are well and above what we do for the public charge regs.
Yeah. And I think there's a really good point there is the human element of this. I think we so often forget, we're a technology company, right? We think about the tech, all of those systems and things, those are our bread and butter. There's other people think about hardware, other people think about vehicles, but often the human part is just left to its own devices. And I think again, from a fleet perspective, these are not necessarily drivers that have made that choice. Consumers have gone out and made a decision. I'm gonna transition. I'm gonna go and go and purchase or lease an electric vehicle, and maybe I'm gonna do that understanding that I'm an early adopter, and that comes with a certain level of like forgiveness. But if you're, someone who's been driving a truck or a van for 35 years and suddenly, someone turns around and says, "Hiya, mate, here's your new vehicle. It's electric and you're not going to a petrol station anymore. You've got to go and fill it up at this newfangled device that's going to take you 45 minutes every time you do it." Suddenly, the frustration levels and the forgiveness levels are much lower because it's something that's been forced upon them. And that means, often we've got to do more to take them on the journey as well. So, that's absolutely on the sort of fleet managers and the companies that operate the fleets and making sure that, they're educating the drivers. But I think that
Yeah,
responsibility sits with everyone else in that supply chain as well. Like
absolutely.
good enough isn't good enough. Like things have to work and they have to be sort of not dumbed down, but they have to be infallible. And we have to understand that the people here, a lot of the people using this infrastructure, it's not a choice. They're not going, "Oh, I'm saving the world. I'm doing a great job." They're doing it because they've been told to do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that what we're finding in sort of collaborating with the people that we've got in our program and what we're then engendering into commercial propositions is exactly that. We are not just a solution sales organization. We are helping them transition and make it work. So my role in terms of partnerships is actually benefits realization, right? My job is to make sure what they wanted to get out of it, they're getting out of it. And then we work out what they're going to do next with it in order to get more out of it. And that's a really important aspect of taking everybody on this as a journey, as opposed to ticking them off a list to say they're done. Right. And so, because it is such a big change. But having said all that, it's also a very long change we've got to execute, right? I talk about this as a 20-year program. I
Mm.
think what we need from a policy point of view is a task force, rather like the solar task force, where we have a 10-year program with some clear aims and steering team and cross-party activity and industry experts molding and evolving the policies to help us transition more accelerated, but realizing that there's over 1 million trucks on the road, let alone all the vans. And what we've got to do is create an ecosystem in which they can all successfully operate. And they're not competing for space, they're not competing for chargers. We're actually deploying assets which can be utilized extensively. So Aegis Energy model down beautifully for what they're planning to do with their hubs. And when you then look at the combination of depots and charging facilities, we then create the network, and that network becomes wider. Therefore, accessibility remains high, and people don't have problems with charging in the right place, having to go more than 5 minutes off route in order to get a charge. And then people can start filling in that network as we go, right? But more and more people we talk to, the number seems to be coming back that more than 80% of people want home depot charging. They want to have control. But equally, what they want is to avoid some of those static or standing charges. And that's where you start depot sharing, you start bringing utilization in, you start diluting those standing charges. And that's what we refer to as a depot point operation, a DPO, not a CPO. Right. And so it's suitable for the vehicles, and that might be tractor and trailer drive through, it might be tractor unit only, it might be long wheelbase van, but they are commercial environments. Probably they're delivering or collecting, or they're in essentially a municipal hub because it's on a main arterial route or in a main logistics facility. Right. That's how we get this working efficiently. That's how we maximize the investment. That's how we attract more private equity investment, is because we demonstrate this can work, and we demonstrate high utilization, and we demonstrate how different it is from public charging with cars.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it comes back to being able to demonstrate that you can shorten that return on investment, right? That there's a huge amount of money required in setting this up, especially when you're getting into things like, HGVs. So we work with First Bus and helped them to do to open up some of their depots. They have a very, very predictable fleet. You've got buses out all day, they come back and charge up overnight. And you've got these standing assets that are just sat there all day. So they've been doing things like some of the sites they open up even to the general public, during the day, or certain parts of certain sites they'll open up to the general public. But they're also doing sort of fleet to fleet agreements where a fleet has guaranteed access to a set of chargers at a certain point in the day. Because I think often with fleet you do get that predictability, and there is a lot of overlap, and we don't need every fleet to have their own their own charging hub, their own depot charging, when within several miles there is another fleet that at some point is going to go through the same process. And we're actually starting to see quite a lot of diversity and things like that as well. We're working with like utility companies that have, a big sort of geographic footprint. And they're working with things like blue light and making sure that there's emergency access to chargers. But even just being able to sort of share access in a controlled way, you're not opening it up to the public, but you're just making an agreement with a set number of fleets that you can interoperate on each other's networks. Is really good. So these sort of closed fleet networks, I think, are going to become a bigger thing as well.
That's really interesting, and I feel like we've touched on quite a lot of topics there. I guess what's kind of coming across is the kind of complexity of all of this. You've got different system management softwares, you've got different expectations of the consumer, whether that's the driver or a business. So are you seeing a lot of this, these buzzwords around AI in your systems? Are you using specific tools to kind of help with that? Is AI kind of a hype? Is it something that's, really helpful in this deployment journey?
I think for us it's definitely a thing, right? It's a thing that we're using on a day-to-day basis already, and it's easy to just get wrapped into the buzzword and say, oh, we're using AI, but what does it actually mean? And I think there's a bunch of things for us as like a software company, but that's probably not too relevant here in terms of our actual how we develop our software. But I think as well, operationally for networks, it's becoming more of a thing. Again, if I go back a couple of years, EV chargers produce a huge amount of data. So we're processing millions of logs a minute, from our entire network. And a couple of years ago, the interface for those was, experts who were really good at searching, right? And they could go and look at, and you picture the scene from The Matrix where
Matrix.
yeah, things coming down and you see the woman in red or whatever. So we've got a bunch of guys who are exactly like that, right? And they are, some of the best experts in the industry. Um, but what we're seeing as we're scaling up is that, and I know one of the other topics we've got on the list is around skills. We're seeing that the market is growing faster than the skill set can grow and roll out to people. And getting that expertise into individuals is quite difficult and time consuming. It takes people, 6 months to get their head around everything. So what we're seeing is that we've got to lower the barrier and demystify some of these things. And so we're rolling out and have already rolled out tools across our network operations team, for example, that allow them to have a more semantic interface to some of those logs. So rather than having to go and get a really complicated search query and say, hey, what's going on here, and look through the lines, you can ask that question and say, on this charger, what was going on here, and that'll go and look up against, all of our logs. It will look up against the OCPP spec. It will look up against past tickets in our system, and it will provide an answer. I'm not necessarily saying it's going to be the right answer every time, and I think we're definitely still at a point where those answers need to be validated or treated as like a hypothesis. But it's definitely like an extra juror if you want, in terms of the
Yeah.
of where it's
And
at.
exactly to Dan's point, it brings speed to spotting things to explore. All right.
Yeah.
That's what we're finding very useful. Right. But beyond that, at the moment, our focus is elsewhere. And it really is. You touched on the flexibility point on the last call, on the last session. Um, we are involved now in the UKPN Future Fleet project, alongside some of our other partners. And it's really interesting because my background was flexibility at Centrica. And people are fascinated and fixated with vehicle to grid. And flexibility is so much more than just vehicle to grid. And so manufacturers are questioning whether they want their large truck battery used in that way. Fair play. It's a big unknown quantity in terms of what it does to their assets. But there's a massive infrastructure piece around flexibility. And the power of flexibility is having thousands, tens of thousands of assets able to do tiny little things and aggregate the impact. And so that future fleet project will determine some really interesting use case scenarios and then move into beta test later this year. And so we'd be, looking forward to talking about what that looks like in later in the year. But it is on the roadmap, along with a lot of other innovation. Autonomous vehicles, also something. We had an event on Monday in Birmingham about autonomy. And so we continue to look forward for innovations so that in 3 years' time, we can be doing those things in the same way we're doing e-freight now. That people 3 years ago went, you're never going to deploy 100 trucks on the road that are electric, right? So it's a really interesting space, and will continue to evolve because of the technologies evolving, not least AI, but also the battery chemistries, and then people's confidence in those technologies and the deployment of more charging infrastructure.
I think the other side to it as well is on the consumer side is there's still a lot of pushback from, say, like a support point of view. So we're currently in the process of deploying some automated tools through our driver support team, but we also know that at the moment I think it's 85% of consumers would rather speak to a human than to speak to a bot, right? So I think there's a narrative at the moment which is we have to try and automate everything and we can use AI, and we're going to get cost efficiencies, but we don't really see it that way, because I think what that does is it devalues the product. We see support as a product. We see it as a value add to our customers. We've got public CPOs that they don't just want to deal with the issue there and then. They want to take the opportunity to delight their customers, because that for them is a critical part of their business. They need to be able to bring customers back to their charge points again and again. And so if we're operating the shop window for that because we're the only people that the only humans that their drivers are ever going to talk to because we're operating their driver support facility, us just removing that completely is would be, sort of commercial suicide, I think. And I think that's where we've seen some of our competitors have started saying, oh, we'll offer it for free. But it's actually like nothing's free. And also you're just removing any value from that product. And might be wrong, but personally, I think that's the wrong direction to go in. So we're treating it more as like, how can we give the people that are delivering our services superpowers to help them be better? And I think that's you know we'll see how it all pans out. Ask me again in 5 years, right? And we'll see where we're at. If we're still doing human-led webinars at that point, who knows? It'll just be just the bots.
You'll have sent your avatar.
It's just the bots. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, we've touched a bit about Flex and AI, but I mean, and you're kind of in the trial stage, but are you seeing this kind of support the business case, or kind of what do you think needs to change to kind of help these, this optimization, this flexibility, these, power markets that people are playing in? How can we help that become part of the commercial model?
Shall I start, Dan?
Yeah, go for it.
So, there's a truism, I think, which came from the battery energy storage market, right? And actually, a lot of the investors and in our world, a lot of the operators, they don't care for this stuff. This is detail beyond what they need to worry about to fulfill their business every day. They're of course interested if someone is using that asset to do something clever and take a share of whatever money comes from it. Right? So some sort of profit share and keeping my costs down because you're being agile and flexing it into the market. Do they have a desire to comprehend that? No. They worry about what it might mean to utilization of their assets. Yes, they do. Right? Because you'll hear them say, but what if I need a truck and you're doing something with it? Because they don't understand and the time's not been spent to help educate them that it will never impede operations because you set operational boundaries that prevent it from ever being a detriment. Okay, so all you're doing is the clever stuff of flexing it when it's not being fully utilized. You're never unwittingly taking it out of an operational delivery. You might give someone the option to take it out of operational delivery because you're saying to them, here's the opportunity that you could take right now, pounds, shillings, pence, if you delay sending a vehicle out by 15 minutes. And they could go, actually, yeah, that one's not time critical. Yeah, sure. Put it in the market for the next 15 minutes. But really, they still don't, they still are far more interested in getting their business dispatched than they are about getting involved in decisions about flex. So they want experts doing that with a level of guarantee and an absolute iron certainty that there's no operation. That's a brave world for some people to operate in. It exists, right? But a lot of people see it as a bit of a black art.
Yeah, I think you're right, and until somebody is doing it at scale and there are really solid case studies about it, it's not clear what the long-term benefit is to the individual organization that's participating. We did an Innovate UK project about 5 years ago around fleet scale smart charging, and the easy part in a way was, coming up with the algorithmic side of it to go and work out, all the what sounds like the complicated bit, how do we work out which vehicles to charge and which vehicles to put on hold, and how do we take into account, the schedule for tomorrow or whatever. But actually, that bit was relatively simple. The bit that was difficult was building an interface for fleet managers to have the level of control that they felt they needed because they didn't believe that they could just press a button and go, "We'll work it out for you." And I think some of this is more advanced in the consumer segment again. So you look at, various different tariffs from companies like Octopus now. You get home, you plug your car in, and you believe that it will charge your car adequately by the morning in the cheapest way possible. But the reason that a consumer does that is because it is, literally 5 times cheaper than the alternative. And so there's a real obvious benefit back to the consumer to doing that. And I think the risks that come into fleet make that more difficult to participate in. But I do think we'll get there. But that I think the long-term benefit of this is more grid scale. So what this is going to give us is going to be a key catalyst to having the level of flexibility that's required for us to be able to move to, a more renewable makeup in our generation. But like you say, a fleet manager doesn't necessarily care about that, for the next year, 5 years, because they've got much more important things to worry about, like are my vehicle's going to get from A to B tomorrow. So it's a little bit chicken and egg. And I think there's got to be probably some, investment in the sort of subsidization of participation. There's been some of that with flex stuff. With the demand response stuff specifically, there's been some good schemes that have happened there. Again, we participated in some of those, but the benefits at the scale of a single fleet never really seem to be worth the risk. And I think, we've got to try and find a way of making that benefit more impactful to the people that are participating in it.
No, that's really interesting. And I guess kind of if we think about like where like other markets where we're seeing some of this stuff being done and just, the successes. So you talked a bit about like subsidy and is there a point where the UK specifically is doing really well, or like should we look to other markets as well to see where we should be learning from, or should we be setting the bar at a higher level in the UK? Like what can we learn from the EU, from Australia, from America that would help ease the journey in the UK?
I think we should always be looking at other markets, and DFT and others do, right? So let's not misrepresent them. They are a very capable, very focused team, and they are helping us. It's just sometimes it feels a lot slower than many of us would like, but that's the realities that they operate within in terms of policy and legislation. But they do a good job of exploring those other markets. Do we adopt what other markets are doing? If it's right, because not all of the other markets translate. They have different size and shapes of vehicles. They have a different mix of ownership models for fleet size, right? You can't look at another market just in its measures and determine that we should do that because it works. We don't have, and again, it was touched on earlier, long haul routes in the UK, right? So we don't have these monstrously long MCS corridors like they do across Europe, right? And so there are different dynamics which will influence whether policy and regulatory specific points work here or not, right? And what I would like to see through greater stakeholder engagement and through a task force is that we engage the industry operators in order to work that out over time with the policymakers and the industry bodies so that we do the right things in an appropriate way. And that's really easy to say, but it's a big undertaking, but it's worth that big undertaking because we have a massive transition. If you look at the amount of power that commercial vehicles are going to require to fully electrify by 2045, we are not going to get there without some significant policy change as well as some significant network support.
I do think there has to be probably more collaboration, and because while we don't have those long stretches of corridors, we're often at the end of those corridors, and so I think the more sort of collaboration and the more sort of conjoined policy there is with the EU, then that can benefit as well. But obviously, we're in a position as well where we can and should go further. There's certain things. Again, it's more on the consumer side, but you look at things like interoperability and how that works on the continent versus how it works in the UK. Interoperability was far more prevalent in the early stages of rollout in Europe than it was in the UK. We ended up with a few big players who didn't want to participate and sort of actively push back against the interoperability piece, and believed that they could own a big enough portion of the market that they didn't have to worry about interoperability. If you go to the continent, you'll go to a charger and it just says scan your e-mobility card or scan your charge card. It doesn't even pretend like there's a connection between the charger and the charging. That there's just an accepted separation between those things, and you will have something in your pocket that you've made a choice to use. Whereas I think here we're still trying to own the entire journey, the charger and the customer. And I think there are parts of that can definitely be beneficial. We've got some really great CPOs in the UK that are doing a good job of engaging with drivers as well. And at the same time, we've got EMSPs like Octopus doing a fantastic job, sort of doing the hard work of getting all the commercials and the contracts in place, while then sort of representing a positive ecosystem for drivers as well. So in some ways, the fact that we were probably sort of 4 or 5 years behind and on the interoperability point might mean that we end up ahead because we can have our cake and eat it.
I
But
mean,
yeah,
we've gone down the route of auto charge, and we will go plug and charge
yeah,
to
yeah,
make the driver's operation as simple as possible, right? But equally to enable roaming,
yeah,
broadly enable roaming, right? I mean, and then most recently through a partnership, we've engaged in a partnership with Corpay. So, and that is enabling us to bring LCV fleets into the depots in order to help utilization and take them away from more expensive public charging locations. Right. So these are the sort of collaborations and evolution of how things work that the roaming technology allows. Right. And it's a really positive step. It changes the dynamics. You can build it into the business case. It de-risks your standing charges. These are the opportunities we've got of rethinking how we develop a electric vehicle fueling network, right? And it's a really exciting space, and it will continue to evolve with these things. And tech is going to be at the heart of it, and the digital tech is going to be increasingly important. And to your point earlier, Louise, undoubtedly within all of that, we're going to start finding there are data insights that AI can go away and help us that might make us think about how we take it further and how we optimize the network and what the right level of investment is and where the next hub should be. But that's what we need to deliver is a good network of charging locations to enable everyone to get around and do more than just back to base work if that's what they need. Because the market is very diverse and multitudes of different operations. And therefore, a network is what's needed to enable that in as we phase out ICE vehicles.
yeah. There's a really interesting point there around data and the access to the transparency of data, and I think again, as part of the public charge point regs, it's now mandatory for public charge point operators to provide feeds of data. We haven't really yet seen what the output of that is going to be, if anything. But I think I would really like to see some of the insight that can be garnered from, you know, single entity, the government, map or whatever, having access to that entire data set. Because I think that's the kind of thing where we can start to open things up, and some of those questions that you're talking about there in terms of like, where should our next hub be, rather than those being sort of just purely commercial questions that a single organization is asking. They need to then be, questions that we're asking at a national level to say, do you know what, actually, there's a Venn diagram where it overlaps, and what we really need is to, have various levels of private investment or fleets or whatever it is come and put something, here on this spot, because that's going to solve the problems of 57 different fleets or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I think that access to data and the collaboration and organizations not being too protective about all of this, it maybe sounds naive, but there's still enough kind of growth in the industry that the best thing for almost every single business operating in this industry is success, right? We should all share in each other's successes because that means that the industry is moving forwards.
And that's the one thing I would say about the collaboration in the work we're doing. It's staggering the level of collaboration between
Yeah.
operators that people believe wouldn't sit next to each other in a room, right?
Mm.
They all have the passion of wanting to help this transition. They've all got the obligation to continue to provide that data for 5 years. That goes into Ricardo, who are now WSP. And so it's appropriately aggregated, it's appropriately discrete to avoid it being reverse engineered for commercial sensitivity, but it's going to give a massive insight into the transition and how else we develop policy to continue that 20-year transition.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've obviously got sort of Charge UK as a body representing, the public charging side of things, but there isn't a an equivalent body that I'm aware of for, specifically for fleet. Certainly not that's got the same level of traction. So, maybe that's something that needs to be considered, or Charge UK need to sort of broaden their horizons into the fleet world as well.
Great, yeah, and there's a lot of optimism amongst this. So I guess, yeah, what do you think is, when we move to that mass adoption stage and we want all of these people choosing EVs, like what do you think is that kind of ask, and what do you think we need to just make sure happens, so that we've got the early adopters, we've got people gradually switching over, but what do you think is that key thing that just will make that transition for the whole of the market to switch over?
If I can start, Dan, the truck OEMs, sales dealerships, are one of the most important areas to make this difference. And this is one area that I would say is similar to the car transition. And I often say that there's not a lot of similarities, right? But dealers helping operators to understand the vehicles that are available and the commercial programs that are available for them to transition in line with their planned fleet replenishment is an absolutely key component of this. Sessions like this are a key component of helping people to demystify, because there's a whole lot of what I would refer to as FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, disseminated. Um, some in naivety, some very intentionally, in order to slow down this transition by people that have got other interests, vested interests. And so we need to help demystify things for people. And the very best thing you can do is put them in vehicles for demonstrations, right? And get them to take a simple first step. So one of the things we've done within the program is what we call the associate membership program. It's a lease vehicle that's discounted by the grant fund to be a diesel cost equivalent for 1 to 5 years with a charger, and it's like my first electric truck, right? And it's all supported by Renault in this instance through the Vitalis program. But it's a great way of getting people into that in a very low risk way. And then they start learning. They learn by doing. The word gets out. The drivers start talking. Again, another similarity. Not many drivers, however skeptical they are when they step into these vehicles that they don't ask for, right, really want to step out and take the keys back to their diesel truck, right? And it may sound simple, contrite, whatever, but I don't get home smelling of diesel and fumes and oil, right? I don't get home with ringing in my ears. I can listen to the stereo without it being really loud. I can get out of a junction quickly, which means I don't get stuck in traffic. I don't get stressed about being late. These are the things that we hear and from drivers. We've got to take the drivers on the journey. They're not the economic buyer, they're the vehicle user, right? And then when they get to a charger, the charger works, they can get on their break, right? And so we make their world as simple as possible, all doable and all really important to the journey.
Yeah, I would just basically just back that up completely. I think the drivers are such a hugely important part of this. Yes, they're not the decision makers. They're not the CFO who's seen the 15-year, cost calculation and sees that the TCO is lower. But, you know, everyone wants a quiet life. And if you've got a fleet manager who's talking about this and all the drivers are like, oh, no, I don't want to deal with that. I heard, someone told me X and Y, they're not great or whatever, then they're just going to say, do you know what, this isn't worth the hassle for me, and start to bog things down. But if you've got instead a set of drivers that are asking for things and proactively looking for it, then I think that makes a big difference. And I think just dealing with some of those day-to-day challenges that drivers have, rather than just treating it as like a top line spreadsheet exercise, are really, really important. So, we see a huge amount of frustration around things like home reimbursement. So, we get a lot of grey fleet customers, obviously not HGVs, but guys who are taking their vans home overnight and are being asked to charge them, and the reimbursement processes take a long time, or there's still things like driver declaration, and that can be really challenging for fleets. But we, for example, have got really good home reimbursement products that give customers, fleet managers, really good visibility of charging, whether it takes place at depot, whether it takes place at home, whether it takes place on the road. You're not just you've got to give the people the right tools to do the job that they're doing right now. And I think if a fleet manager's got to go and log into 3 different systems, or sift through, someone's energy bill and a bunch of receipts they've got from public charging, and then weigh that up against the cost of charging at the depot, you're making their lives more complicated. And that's going to slow things down. So anything that can sort of ease the operational transition of this is just as important as the kind of technology and energy transition and the economic transition. I think the operational side is really, really, really important as well. Got to win the hearts and minds as well of everyone along that whole supply chain.
Definitely. And yeah, well, good to know that the customer is always at the heart of this, and that there's already innovation in industry, and just actually a lot of this is already happening on the ground across the UK. So I mean, hopefully it continues. I'm sure it will.
It will.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat from the audience. So do slot them in if you do have any last minute questions. But I'll probably just wrap up there. So thank you so much, both Dan and Neil, for joining. We've had a really good discussion around everything across the fleet, from data to flex to skills to everything that's going on. So hopefully it's been a useful session for those listening in. And just on the theme of collaboration, here at Energy UK, we have the Young Energy Professionals Forum. So for anyone who is starting out in that journey and has less than 10 years of experience, whether that's energy or kind of, that relation between fleets and energy, and that collaborative piece, it is a free to join forum for anyone with less than 10 years of experience, and we do have awards that are open up that are free to nominate your colleagues towards, and that will be judged by industry experts and judges across categories such as STEM trailblazers, supply chain innovation, customer champions. So if you do want to get involved and kind of contribute to that energy and electrification journey, do get involved. But I think we're just about at time now, so I will hand back to Jordan.